This is part 2 of the episode with Ines Wilson, where we are now going to be discussing Codex Tyranids and doing a masterclass on that. So, how to build a list, how to navigate the army or to pilot the army on the table. What are the army's strengths and weaknesses? So what do we need to be careful about as Tyranid players? But also, if you're playing against Tyranids, hopefully this will give you some insight into what the army does on the table, what are the tricks that they bring to the table, and how to play against that. So yeah, without further ado, Ines, your rating of Tyranids of the internal balance from part 1, you didn't rate them very highly. However, I would say that it's fairly interesting to see how what GW is doing with Tyranids, or what they have been doing with Tyranids uh, over different editions, because it seems like the play style of the army is constantly changing. Like at the beginning of ninth edition, you had I guess the Devil Gaunts. Then you had the Crasher Stampede, which was like a completely different play style. Then the Codex came out, and you had transhuman warrior
Everything.
spam. Oh, everything, but the most prominent, I guess, was the transhuman warrior spam. Um, Nowadays you don't see anything like this anymore. Like none of those is actually a thing.
Even remotely anything to do with this codex now, no. Tyranids definitely took a very big change in design dimension this edition. If you played against Tyranids in ninth edition, the prevailing joke was it felt like they randomly picked 4 stats and made every single one of them 1.2 high on every unit in the
Yeah.
codex. So you had stuff like Zoanthropes being strength 5 with 4 wounds and a 4 invulnerable save, and you know, you had the warriors being randomly toughness 5 with 3 wounds and transhuman and hit on threes and all that kind of thing, and all of that got stripped out, and it now feels like everything they randomly picked 3 stats and they're 1.2 low on
Yeah.
everything in Tyranids. So just as an example, there is very little melee in the books, but it goes above strength 9. So the hive tyrant being a great example, came from being last edition strength 11 AP4 damage 3 to strength 9 AP2 damage 3. Just things
Hmm.
like that, where just like across the board everything just got suppressed and pushed
Calm
really
down.
far down,
Hmm.
much more than anything did last edition. And also the resilience took a hit across the board. So things that used to have 3 up saves now have 4 up saves. Things that used to have 2 up saves, 3 up saves now. Just very, very broadly for all of the light stuff, everything kind of just diminished, lost a wound, lost a point of toughness. In addition, where things were generally intended to get less lethal, like everything stayed just as lethal to Tyranids because
Hmm.
everybody else's AP went down, but our saves went down and our toughness went down, and our wound count went down. So like the damage output into Tyranids stayed the same. So the army projected more towards being like a bit more of a glass cannon. Now to match with that, they gave a lot of kind of shenanigansy stuff to Tyranids that they didn't have before. Tyranids before were kind of outside of specifically Overrun, which was a mental stratagem last edition.
Yep.
There was not a lot of this army does thing besides what it says on the tin. There was like the stratagems. There was the imperatives for like advance and charge or advance and shoot or like plus and like invulnerable saves. But it was kind of like very telegraphed, very honest. The army did the thing it did, and it did it in front of you. Now nids are a lot more movement-y and jank, and you've got things like the gargoyles that can move after shooting, the biovore spore spawning, which remains just as good as secondaries, which is much better secondaries than ever was. They screen now. You've got things like the Paravores that strip cover, just like a lot more like individual tools that you can use to create like different ways of approaching the game. The things like even things like the terminals being able to move when you end near them, and then with detachments with things like swarming masses, like there's a lot more stuff you can do to create weird situations for your opponent with turrets now. And that's good because they don't do any damage. So you better start creating some situations, buddy, because you're gonna it's gonna take your entire army to kill everything you ever want to kill.
Hmm.
They also have very good access to lone operatives with things like Death Leaper and the Neurolictors. Death Leaper is the biggest gaslighting model in the game. The guy's like 14 inches tall and hits like a Chaos Chosen Sergeant.
Uh
Um,
huh.
and you're just like, but you're huge. Like this is a 70-point lone op. I need to stop tricking myself into thinking that he's good. He's a 70-point lone op and he's going to stand on an objective and have fight first and be annoying. I don't need you to be good in combat, buddy. But he looks like he should be good in combat. So as a
Yeah.
Terran player, you will be gaslit into thinking that you should charge him into things. 100%. It's
Okay.
happened many times. So
So
yeah,
what?
that's kind of
Yeah.
nids.
So they have their strengths, they have their weaknesses. What would be, maybe let's look at this even more than singles and teams. Like, what is this army comfortable playing against? What
I
would
mean,
you, as a team captain, for example, what would you be comfortable putting Tyranids into?
I think it's kind of better to approach that from the other side of like how does this army
Okay.
win games is probably the better way to look at that, and
Hmm.
then I can tell you why that what how that matches up into certain things, right? So the way Tyranids win games, Tyranids are almost unparalleledly good at just scoring points. Tyranids put points on the table faster than any other army in the game in the right situation. You have gargoyles which can deep strike, shoot, and then move 6 inches. You have, or they can, you can have the spore mines, which are the Bivore places a spore mine anywhere within 48. That unit can deploy teleport homers, can score you engage, score you behind enemy lines, all that kind of thing. You've got lots of little scoring units like Pyrovores, Rippers, like lots of like 20 to 30 point unit ranges. And then you have the constant ability to provide that forward pressure to just hold your opponent back and just just dam the floodgates with gargoyles, with rippers, with like big monsters that like control space and prevent your opponent coming towards you. And the army is very good at just building up, building up, and building up until eventually your opponent breaks through, and then they kill all your stuff because your stuff isn't very resilient, but they couldn't get to you for 4 turns, and suddenly you've put 95 points on the scoreboard and there's nothing they can do about it. Or you play that from like the horde aspect and you just keep stacking points, and it doesn't matter that you're not killing anything because they can't stop you scoring. And that's Tyranids. That's what Tyranids is best at. They are probably the best army in the game at doing that. What that means is the things that they're okay playing into is any army that like wants to play a slow game into Tyranids is terrible at doing that because you can't play a slow game into Tyranids because the second you try to come out your deployment zone on like turn 4, if you've not dealt with anything to that point, you try to come out your deployment zone on turn 3, like you build up your like you're trying to build up an incremental, you're trying to conserve resources and get to the late game. Turns are like, buddy, I already put 90 points on the scoreboard. You got to catch up. All right, I'm gonna go, and then like they'll play the last 3 turns basically solitaire as they just like remove your models off the board, but it doesn't matter because they stayed in reserve or they waited or they didn't want to walk into extreme line of sight until they had enough CP to do it, or they got the positioning, or they killed some of your chaff. Right, they're trying to play that slow game. Terrorists are great at exploiting that. What they're not great at dealing with is the armies that just say, "Oh, cool, you're in front of me. Bet, let's kill that." So World Eaters is a great example of that. You are going to have a
Hmm.
really bad time. A World Eaters army that just goes, "Hey, buddy, I see you're trying to screen me," and then car charges, and the entire army just charges your screen and is like, "We'll stand here, but you're not going to have stuff, and you're going to keep trying to do this, and I'm going to do this every turn until you got nothing left, and I'm just going to keep going, and I'm just going to keep pushing through, and
You
I've got
just run
fly,
out of
and
the table at some point.
yeah, you run at a table to run away from them in, and you don't do enough damage to them to slow them down. So any army that can just kind of like absorb your damage while bouncing, while like running through you, any army that can like fully screen its backfield and just like stop you sneaking in can be annoying. So uh, something like orcs, where there's just there's going to be a million orc units and trucks and Gretchen and Storm Boys and stuff like that, and they're just sat in the deployment zone and you can't really access it. And if you try to speed bump them, and then those kind of matchups also are a little bit first turn flippy. If you go first, you can like maybe stem the bleeding enough, but if you go second, you're just going to get run over. And then you have the archetypal Eldar's going to suck. Sorry, can't help it. Um,
Mm.
the swarm build can maybe get away with it because Eldar just don't have that many shots, and you can maybe choke them out. But like a traditional sort of like Monster Mash, Invasion Fleet, or Synaptic Nexus list is just going to run into problems with the raw damage output of an army like Eldar, where they can just kill you. And then you have the kind of the damage profiles on Tyranids. You might have something like Chaos Knights or Imperial Knights that can be a little bit problematic if that game plan doesn't work. If they just get too out on the board too quickly, you try to play too clever, and they like they hit a high roll or they get a charge you weren't expecting, and suddenly you find that you can't hurt them. Like that kind of like high toughness like stat check army. So Votan, Chaos Knights, Imperial Knights are probably like the archetypal examples of that. Just armies that are a lot of toughness 10 plus. Tyranids have a very tough breakpoint at toughness 10 because they're very much relying on X Greens and Maliceptors, which are strength 8 and strength 10 respectively. A little bit of Zoanthropes, but Zoanthropes are very swingy and usually about one shot in that kind of situation.
Hmm.
Where if they low roll, there is no coming back. You're just going to start losing models before you can recover it.
Yeah. Okay. So when you think about list building with them, or no, let's not go with list building. Let's go with a different question that I have. So, are Tyranids better at any specific rule set or terrain type? And by that I mean like
I
GW,
don't think
WTC, or
so.
UKTC.
Tyranids are a little bit they it's a little awkward because there's so many detachments now, it's a little bit generalized. The swarm doesn't care, right? The swarm will play on anything
Hmm.
because you're not hiding 200 termagants anyway. Who gives a toss? So like it doesn't really matter. It appreciates like denser terrain because it can move block more efficiently and things like that.
Hmm.
But it also just like isn't really a big deal. The monster mashier builds tend to prefer boards that have more open sight lines, especially from strategic reserve, because a big part of the army is wanting to put things like execrenes into strategic reserve, coming in off the board edge and catching good angles and good shooting lines, and not taking too much damage back, and using the ability to advance and shoot with the Hive Tyrant aura to like control space and threaten sight lines. So like GW terrain can be a little awkward for that because the board edge sight lines are not great because it's not playing a lot of terrain. Like the terrain it has is fairly like into the ground, but it covers a lot of base with the templates. So that kind of terrain can be a little awkward. Where something more like UKTC or WTC, like they are dense boards, but they definitely have better like reserve sight lines. So I'd say like in general, it's not too big a deal, but there's definitely like aspects of things that are worth considering. You might be inclined to play, a little bit more off the board if you're playing on GW terrain versus or WTC terrain versus like UKTC, or you might be a little more inclined to play out of strategic reserve because it's more flexible. But WTC is probably like the middle ground between those two, where the terrain can be dense, but the sightlines are still pretty good in the right situations, and you can definitely catch the right angles. But like, I don't think any one terrain set for like those kinds of builds. And then you have something like the Norns build, which the Norn build really wants like unobstructed like a good place to hide in deployment zone and then quick access to objectives,
Hmm.
which it's kind of depends on which terrain set and what mission you play. And it's hard to be like any one specific one is better or worse for that because it really is hard to like that'll very much vary depending on terrain layout even and mission more than it does depending on format.
Okay. Um, so are there any? Oh, by the way, what is Atlanta going to be playing? Is it like
It's on
GW or
GW
is it?
terrain. It's
Oh,
being run
it's
by Games
GW. Okay.
Workshop, so you would imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're
All
using
right.
the GW layouts.
Fine. All right. So yeah, let's jump into list building. I know that you brought a certain list with you, so we will look into that in just a moment. But are there any staple units that you start building your list with
For sure.
at all times?
So for me, there's very kind of like a really easy way to break up list building, which is to say that you are going to budget some amount of points to scoring, some amount of points to your killing power, some amount of points to your like support suite, right? And the like there's not a hard and fast line there, and units will cross boundaries and all that kind of thing. But it's a fairly comfortable way to think about things. Is like units are usually in the list for a job, and I usually try to budget like at least like 300 points ish to scoring. Like I want to have some number of units that score points. I'm going to budget some amount for support units that don't necessarily do a ton else, but that I want to have access to because you want to be able to like increase the efficiency of your good units. And then you're usually going up with somewhere in the region of like 600 to 1,000 points of like dedicated damage units that are there to go and cause problems, solve problems, and then like the last kind of 400 to 600 points depending falls into like flex slots and just like weird utility units or counter meta things or doubling up on a roll. Like so, it's not like super specific in terms of like you must have this, but like in a general way to think about it. So running through them in kind of order. So starting with like the general scoring units. The Biovore, I think, is a one-to-one inclusion. You always have a Biovore in a Tyranid list. It is a single model that produces a Spore Mine. That Spore Mine is the most efficient model in the game for scoring points because it's a 25 millimeter base. It doesn't get blocked by infiltrators. You can slide into deployment zones. You can deploy teleport homers. It's very consistent. Gives you a very good score floor. Worst case scenario, you have that guy. You're scoring 15 on deploy teleport homers and 10 on engage without really having to try. Like that's fine. For 75 points, you put that guy in the list. Then you're talking like Ripper, like the individual Ripper swarms for 20 points, the Pyrovore for 30 points, the Gargoyles for 75 points, Death Leaper and Neurolictors for 70 and 65, respectively. Just kind of fall into this like bucket of units that will stand places, do things, screen, score, be utility, just like be a thing that does a thing for you. And I end up with something like two Ripper Swarms, two Pyrovores, two Neurolictors, Death Leaper, and a Biovore. And that comes out in somewhere in the region of like 400-ish points. That's just my dedicated scoring suite. Some of them will do additional things, like Death Leaper can charge. Neurolictors are a damage utility buff. Pyrovores do remove cover. Gargoyles can be just like a utility unit for move blocking and things like that. But that's kind of like my baseline of I want some number of that. You could definitely go a little bit higher on some of it, a little bit lower on some of it, but that's
Hmm.
kind of like the rough mix that I found is pretty reasonable. Other things you might be looking for in that role is things like Raveners, um,
Von
the
Ryans?
yeah, Von Ryan's Leapers are kind of the same, but Von Ryan's Leapers tend to be more of like a bad damage unit that works with specific detachments rather than like anything else. They're not really like they don't have any like movement shenanigans. They're decently fast, but they don't have a gun, so they can't really advance an action or anything like that. So generally,
Hmm.
not outside of like specifically Vanguard Invasion, they're not the most dynamic unit. But Raveners have like the go back into reserve mechanic and things like that, so they definitely fit into that slot. You might see stuff like Termagants or Neurogaunts fill into that role, right?
Hmm.
Then you kind of get into utility units, which is in addition to some of the stuff like neurolictors that I spoke about, is going to be things like your neuro tyrant, which is the you apply the -1 to battlefield across the battlefield for Shadow in the Warp, so making them take a battle shot text and everything at -1. Suddenly pushes anything leadership 7 to very, very likely to fail, and this unit leadership 6 pushes to likely to fail, and you can
Hmm.
kind of like start like even Custodian's army start failing leadership tests at that point, which can be very useful in the right situation, especially with the new neurolictor. You're talking about things like the generic Hive Tyrant or the Winged Hive Tyrant, where you have like the free stratagem for the battle tactics that applies in an aura. A lot of the good stratagems, like the Feel No Pain from Invasion Fleet, the Armor of Contempt from Synaptic Nexus, are battle tactics. You can get a lot of mileage out of that. They're also both of them are both like decent objective holders. They're resilient monsters that can stand in a place and do some decent work there. And then you might also look at something like a Moloch or a Trygon, where they're more like, yes, they're kind of damage units, but they're more like utility on the way through. The Moloch is like it helps you. You can remove screens in the movement phase. It's a good ingress option. It just like creates problems. Same thing with the Trygon, but the Trygon is more specific. It's more like a unit that you use to go and make your opponent's home objective life miserable with the 3-inch deep strike off of rapid ingress into charging the next turn. It's kind of a damage output, but I feel like calling a Trygon a damage output unit. If I do that, it'll try to shank me in my sleep and miss, because it never does anything. So it's more like a ball of OC that goes in and kills like 2 dudes out of a Warp Spider squad and then holds the objective off them, and that's all you were there for, buddy. And sometimes it'll do a little bit more than that, and you'll be happy with that. But calling it a damage unit, I feel like would be disingenuous to the guy's inability to hit or wound. Um, Big monsters like that being strength 9 is an insult to the fabric of Warhammer, by the way.
Yeah,
Um,
unfortunately, but this is the
uh,
reality we have
so
to
that's
live in.
kind of like the utility, and there's maybe some other units that would slot into there. Like you could definitely have Paravors be inside that kind of like general suite. Um, you might talk about something like the Parasite of Mortrex or Turvigons in like that kind of general build as well. Um, there's not like a ton else that's super interesting.
Yeah, I wanted to ask
Bard
about.
Gods would be the last one
I
that was
wanted to
like
ask
really in
about
that slot.
the. Sorry, wanted to ask about the Tyran effects because it did see play before the Codex. Now, has actually changing that damage reduction actually completely eliminated it
Well,
from the
it
game?
also went up 40 points
Oh,
while
that too.
getting nerfed.
Hmm.
The Tyrannifex was very specifically an incredible frontliner with -1
With the
damage, flip
flamer.
save, toughness 11, and a flamer. It was really good at just being at the front and being resilient and causing problems and getting into combat with like weird damage to stuff and just holding it there. And it just doesn't do that anymore. And that was
Hmm.
it, the flamer was a thing you had while you were doing the other job, but the main job was it was a linebacker for your front field, and it just doesn't do that now. It just isn't the same unit, so it's hard to justify it now, especially when it's almost the same points as 2 exocrines.
And the Rupture Cannon plays to the imagination both of the enemy and the owner of the Tyran effects
The
because it
rupture cannon,
looks.
I don't believe the rupture cannon is capable of hitting. I refuse to accept that as a thing that's ever happened in a game of Warhammer.
Yep, yep. With only 2 shots, I
If
mean.
it had, if it was just like an actual damage profile instead of 2d6 as well, like
I mean that 2d6 does speak to your imagination,
no, it speaks to two
but
damage.
yeah, I mean with my rolls definitely. So yeah, something it's
No,
forgettable.
the Tyrannifex is there's two sat on my shelf that I bought and played 2 games with and have not painted yet. That are the reason that it got nerfed. That's I know that much.
Yeah, and
Um,
for me it because it's the same set as the Tervigon. I actually have it on blue tack, just half assembled, and I just attach the limbs and the guns and
I've
so
got a
on.
Turbogon as
As a,
well. I own 5 of that kit and none of them are painted, so
I just
that's
have one, so I interchange the parts to
that's
to
fair.
adjust. But it's
Um,
yeah.
so the last thing you kind of end up in then is where are you getting damage output from Tyranids? And
Hmm.
the answer is nowhere, but we work really hard anyway. So there's kind of like 3 different types of damage output. There's like small range shooting, there's small melee, and there's big monsters that kind of do something. So you're talking in some detachments, you might look at stuff like Von Ryan Sleepers, Raveners, Gene Stealers, specifically in Vanguard Onslaught, like that's kind of the damage output stuff. You might look to them and get some reasonable answers there. In terms of shooting, you're probably looking at specifically zone tropes as far as like infantry shooting goes, but you might also see like ranged warriors or melee warriors in the other slot. Like there's kind of like some stuff in there that's pretty reasonable. And then for big shooting, which is like the only thing that the army is like really competitive on, the Exocrine and the Maliceptor are both fantastic data sheets that do exactly what they say on the tin. They are D6 plus 3 shots, damage 10, strength 8 or 10, decent AP, damage 3 shooting. They have decent range, they are reasonably resilient, they do exactly what they say on the tin, and they are pretty good at it. They are not like incredible units at 135 and 170, though they don't have to be. They are just good, efficient units that do the job. Personally, for me, every list starts with 3 extra queens and 2 maliceptors, and then you like have a conversation after that about what else you want. The Trygon also, like, again, technically fits into this job, and this is where you would look for things like the Norn Emissary or the Norn Assimilator. I think the Emissary is close enough to viable that I like wouldn't be surprised to see one on the table. I also wouldn't be shocked to see it lose most games it plays in sort of like the 4-1, the 4-0, 3-0, 5-0 bracket. Like if I saw a thing up there, I would be like, "Oh wow, I'm surprised you're still going." More than I would be surprised that they're up there. Um, but like they're definitely like they're not unviable. I think like the Zoanthropes, Extra Green Maliceptors are kind of like the three that you'll usually see as far as like a package goes, and they work pretty well together. The Extra Green gives reroll ones to hit out to a target that is shot. The Maliceptor itself has additional resilience buffs, and the Zoanthropes give out an invulnerable save, which can help in the right situation. And then you can get like Pyrovores to ignore cover and stuff like that to like boost that damage up a little higher but it's a lot of AP2 and AP3, which usually doesn't need a ton of help, which means that they can definitely get there. Zoanthropes are the only source of strength 12 plus in that situation, being strength 12. Maliceptors are strength 10 and Extra Queens are strength 8. But Extra Queens are
Hmm.
significantly cheaper. Like for the points of 2 Maliceptors, you almost get 3 Extra Queens. So it's very
Yeah.
hard to justify not running 3 Extra Queens, especially given that they're the one with a 36-inch range.
Right. Okay. So as I mentioned before, you brought a list of yours
I did.
with you for today. Uh, I'll put it on the screen. Share screen.
Weirdly, it's going to have almost all the units I said I liked there.
Yeah, I mean, no surprise there. But let's do it in a form. I think the list is on the screen now. So let's do this in the form of explain like I'm five what
Sure.
this is and why it's here. So the list starts with it's the invasion fleet. So again, it's the basic index
Love me some white bread.
detachment.
Love me some white bread.
Hmm. All right. So a good start there, and then we start with the characters. We have the Death Leaper. So my question is that dude infiltrates, loan up, and so on. How do you actually play him on the table? Do you put him on an objective immediately right at the beginning of the game, or do you keep him back
Yeah,
just
Death Leaper
yeah?
tends to be like put them on like your side objective that you're gonna like put some other stuff towards, and then maybe Death Leaper can go off and have some fun and like chase down some small scoring units and be like generally obnoxious with stealth and a 4 vulnerable save and a 3 armor save and like potential to be obnoxious. But he'll usually like start on a side, maybe like with a neuralist or something like that, and just like chase down random garbage. Like he'll hunt down your opponent's warp talons or warp spiders or warp whatevers, and just like be a bit of a bully. Just generally an underpointed unit for 70 points. Um,
So would the Death Leaper be? And I know it's a very like specific question, but I also play Tyranids, so it's useful information for me. Is the
I've
Death
been
Leaper,
tricked
for
into a
example?
coaching session.
Well, in a way, that it is supposed to be a masterclass. But are you? So, do you take the Death Leaper, for example, and deploy him first as your first unit to block off the opponent's infiltrators, or do you actually conserve him until later when you know what your where your opponent has put the scoring unit?
It 100% depends on what your opponent is doing, right? Like if
Okay.
your opponent has other infiltrators, it is more important that I have control of those so that I can make my opponent have to walk at me than it
Hmm.
is to have Death Leaper in a perfect position. At the end of the day, Death Leaper is a 70-point unit. Do not let Death Leaper's size and prominence trick you into thinking that they're a unit that requires investment. If all Death Leaper does is sit on an objective, or honestly sits in a corner and scores me an engage point every turn, that
Hmm.
is 100% a fine job for Death
Worth it.
Leaper.
Yeah.
Death Leaper does not have to do a lot. Death Leaper is a 70-point lone op. Death Leaper costs less than 5 Shadow Specters. It costs almost the same as 5 Scouts. Do not expect great things from Death Leaper, but Death Leaper is one of those units that has potential to high roll. But you do not have to expect anything from Death Leaper. You barely have to give resources to Death Leaper. He just is a good, efficient 70-point unit.
Hmm. All right. Okay. Fine. Then we have the Hive Tyrant. With a heavy venom cannon, monstrous bone sword, and lash whip, and adapted biology, which is the 5-up phenopane.
Yep.
What is his role in this one?
So this is your like I suppose, linchpin unit. This is the anchor around which the rest of the list is built. He provides a free battle tactic to a unit within 12, which means mostly the invasion fleet's 5 up feel no pain stratagem, being able to just spam that basically on cooldown twice a turn, even to have 2 units be more resilient than their points say. He also provides an advance and shoot aura and is reasonable enough in combat and relatively resilient, with a 2-up armor save, a 4-up vulnerable save, and then a 5-up feel no pain, which after he's taking damage increases to a 4-up. Like he can get stuck in and beat the snot out of random garbage units that are brawling in the midfield. Don't expect like a massive punch up, but he is strength 9, AP 2, damage 3. So anything like a custody squad with an invulnerable save, like you'll start making it take damage eventually, and you shouldn't take too much back. So you're just like kind of trying to brawl through that mid game and use the free stratagems to really just like push damage home.
Yeah,
Depending on how
plus
your tournament pack rules, you could also like CP reroll things like advanced rolls and shots. Doesn't work in WTC, but in some formats it does. So your mileage may vary with free battle tactic command points, but command point rerolls. But
and especially if you can force something like Custodes to fail their battle shock test or something, then this or like the Trygon and its damage output become way more viable.
yeah, for sure. If you're
Uh,
charging into stuff that can -1 damage, like yeah, don't
mhm.
expect a ton out of your damage 3 guy when they've got 3 wounds and you suddenly lose 50% of your damage output. But
Yep.
it's definitely like a unit that does the right kind of thing. It's expensive, don't get me wrong, but it holds down the fort. It provides free stratagems. Like it does exactly what you're looking for. At the end of the day, if all it does is sit on an objective and scores you 10, scores you 20 primary, that's enough as well. Like it's fine if it controlled space, gave you some free rerolls, and let you advance and shoot some extra screens. Did its job.
So yeah, so I wanted to ask, uh, what does it synergize best with? Again, you said that
Guns.
guns.
Tanky guns,
Hmm.
which is a clue for what's coming up next in the list.
Yeah. Okay, but before we get there, oh yeah, one question, because the Vanguard Onslaught allows you to take a winged Hive Tyrant and then you can make him a lone op. So is that the tactic that you would go for, or is that just cute
It
and
works, but the Winged Hive Tyrant is a little more awkward in that its ability is like -1 to it like debuffs combat within
mhm,
12 rather than having the advanced shoot aura. So it doesn't really synergize super well with the kind of the shooting presence. And also the only battle tactics that attachment really has is the one where you pick a friendly unit and an enemy unit, and because that doesn't work with the CP reduction ability, the Winged Hive Tyrant just kind of doesn't do a lot in that
yeah,
attachment. Like the damage output isn't really high enough to justify um the damage output just really isn't high enough to justify spending that much resources on it, and I
yeah,
broadly prefer the foot tyrant even in that detachment. Like if you're going to want the free strats or you want the anchor unit, the assault is better than anything that wing tyrant does because the guy is resilient enough that like you're not just going to randomly die to incidental shooting, so you don't really have to invest too heavily in it. And
hmm,
the wing tyrant is huge and awkward to move in a very very strange way as well. Pivoting those wings around buildings can cost you a ton of movement.
yeah. I guess he's like a distraction Carnifex, because if people still have like live the memory of what this used to do in the previous edition, and now you tell them this now has lone up as well, people will go batshit
I try not to
about it.
plan around my opponents having like
Yeah, obviously.
inbuilt psychological trauma, but
Yeah,
I mean, I guess technically that is a thing you could do.
I think so. Anyway, moving on. Neurotyrant. Again, that's your warlord. What's the role? We know that it decreases the
It
leadership.
sits. All it does is This is the guy that sits on your home field objective, and like you get the two neuraloids that can hand out synapse to units that are going far away, which buffs up the stratagems for invasion fleet. You means you can do the 5-up feel no pain with the units a little more isolated, or bring guys back in a gargoyle squad or something like that. Just
Hmm.
keeps your units ticking a little bit. Gives that big debuff for the turn that you do your shadow norp to try and drop your opponent on some primary, some scoring potential. Maybe give you the opportunity to do some stratagems without or to stop them using some stratagems in an awkward position. And it also is just like a not unreasonable linebacker for your deployment zone, where it's got a 2d6 shot flamer at strength 5, AP1, damage 1, that or AP2, sorry, that your opponent's just not going to want to mess with in like a general casual sense.
Hmm.
It's an Overwatch threat. It's a monster itself, so it can, it's like not going to take a ton of damage. It can fire its flamer into combat if it gets charged by something, and it's like not OC1, so it's not going to like randomly get charged by like a Calexis assassin and lose the objective. So it just holds down your fort a little bit, protects your biovore, all that kind of stuff, without really being, while providing a little bit of marginal utility on top of that. That for 105 points is hard to complain at.
Hmm. Is the enhancement in the synaptic nexus something that you would always go
If
for?
you're gonna play Synaptic Nexus, put the enhancement on this guy. Yeah,
Mhm.
Strength 6 AP2 isn't much better than Strength 5 now AP1. But it's just one of those like I prefer Invasion Fleet for the everything else package, and it's such a marginal buff that I
Mm,
wouldn't change the attachment just for that. But if you're gonna play Synaptic Nexus, yeah. If you're gonna play Vanguard Invasion, put Hunting Ground on this guy to start battle shocking your opponent when they come in from reserve. There's lots of things you can do with the Neurotarget. It's just a good caddy. It's also like if you're randomly playing Imperial Knights, a unit that doesn't mind sitting on the backfield and not dying, giving up Warlord kill.
yeah. Okay.
And in the horde detachment, it holds the enhancer for +3 to advance to pile and consolidation, which works really well on Neurogaunts when you can run 22 models attached to him and have
Hmm.
that unit just move 12 inches during the fight phase after killing something or after something else kills something. Gives you a lot of mobility in that army.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sounds like a staple. Sounds like something that should be in every list. Moving on. Gargoyles. Some say the best unit in the Tyranid Codex. You have one, two, three units,
Yep.
if I'm counting correctly. All right. Tell us what what they can do and how can they be best utilized.
Gargoyles are OC2 Shadow Specters. So if you've played against Eldar recently, they just drop in, they move, they drop in, they shoot, they move, they block, they score. They make your opponent's life awkward. You pin them in the deployment zone. You take them off objectives. They're just there to flip primary, score points, be obnoxious. They have the endless swarm stratagem to bring them back if they take damage. You get D3+3 guys backing up in a squad, two squads if you're within synapse range. So your opponent has to kill full ones. You can like hide two guys inside a building, so if your opponent activates them, doesn't kill the full squad. You can regenerate, steal some primary. Just lots of little marginal things to do. At 7.5 points a model, it's really, really hard to complain. They don't do any damage. You don't need to do any damage. They're just they just do exactly what you need. They give you some OC. They can rapid ingress. They can deep strike. All that kind of thing. And they're just a completely normal unit that does everything you would want it to do.
And they provide
Off the board,
target
they can go
saturation.
18 inch. Yeah, off the board they go 18 plus d6 because their guns are assault. They can advance in action. I don't believe the flash boards are pistols, so that's one thing they can't do is they can't fire. God, they can't fire in combat, but it's not a big deal. You don't
Hmm.
really need that. They're not there for actions. They're just a good all round unit that does all the core stuff you're looking for.
Yeah. Okay. So three, but I've seen lists with like four units, and also
Yep.
in like greater numbers. People tend to like incorporate them. I think it would be a sin not to bring them with you for
Yeah,
all
you
of the
could
stuff that
definitely
they
like justify going up to like I think like 40 is probably like about where I would want to end. Like I wouldn't want to run much more than that because they definitely do have like a marginal utility where
do.
you
Hmm.
start running out of stuff to do with them at some point. But they are just good. You can drop in 908 from somebody, shoot the target, move sync to just towards them, and just pin them in place, and that's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Okay. Moving on. A Biovore. Uh.
Makes a spore every turn, scores
Uh
points.
huh.
It's great. Nothing more to
Right.
add.
So yeah, but this is okay. So it is self-explanatory. But then I'll stop here to ask a question about uh playing the secondary missions with Tyranids. So if you were to take that list to a tournament, would you ever consider taking tactical?
Sure.
Or oh, okay,
I would definitely consider it for about 30 seconds before I wrote down teleport homers and behind enemy lines on my score sheet. Um, that's
so definite.
disingenuous. This army is fantastically good at scoring fixed secondaries. Deploy teleport homers is very easy, and then like you have kind of dealer's choice of the rest. Behind enemy lines is not undoable. Engage on all fronts is very easy, and then you can also look at things like storm hostile objective if you're playing something like vital ground or supply drop, where there's like two objectives that you're going to be fighting over very frequently. In those kind of situations, like it's very easy to justify. If you're playing it to something that like does close out its backfield deployment zone. Maybe you're playing search and destroy deployment with the quarters, where it's really hard to get to, or you're going to be fighting over the middle against an army like World Eaters or Orcs. You can play tactical, and the army is just as good at it. It's just less. It's much less controlled, and it
Yeah.
doesn't allow you to front load your points as significantly because you have no control over what you're going to draw. Whereas when you play tactical, you know the pace you're scoring your point, or when you play fixed, you know the pace you're scoring points, and you know how much you need to hold your opponent down on primary, how much you need to hold their head underwater to make sure that you're staying ahead. Whereas with tactical, you are leaving it a little bit more up to the gods.
Hmm.
And that's fine. It's just a thing you have to be aware of, and generally not the way that I'm trying to approach playing this list. I'm very much trying to approach it from the hold my opponent down, choke them out, score my points, and then if I get tabled, I get tabled. At least I won by a few points, right?
Hmm.
That's what I'm looking for here. And tactical generally isn't as good for that specific way of approaching it.
So it might be a little bit too early because we haven't revealed the full list, but still, um, tactical. Many people say that the benefit of tactical is that it actually allows you to have a wee bit more CP because of the discarding the card and regaining the CP. So when you build lists for Tyranids, do you take that into consideration that you might need to use more CP and then build a list so that it plays better tactical, or is it negligible and fixed because the
The
army
best
just does it
stratagem.
so well?
So first of all, this army does not have access to grenade or tank shock, which is so much of my CP train in every other army I play that you just
Mm-hmm.
don't have access to. So there is already like a limiter there on you just don't have that ability to flow through CP as quickly because you can definitely in like a marine army or something like that that's just like incidentally near things and charging things burn through an extra 2 CP a turn on just doing the 3 to 6 mortal wounds that those two stratagems accommodate you. This army does not have that. There is no outlet like that for just turning command points into damage in the same way that those armies have.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what that usually results in, and then the other one is the best stratagem this detachment has is the Feel No Pain, which is a battle tactic which you're going to be making zero at least once from the tyrant, at least once per battle, and the tyrant's once per turn, not once per battle round. So you've just slamming out a couple Feel No Pains every turn, and you just don't really need the CP investment for that. So it's definitely nice, but this army, like overwatching with this army, is a joke anyway. Nothing is good at
Mm-hmm.
it. So you're just like, as long as you got one or two sitting there to do a film paid, maybe you go for a clutch overwatch in a situation where it could like really result in things. But generally, you're just it's not that CP hungry. It doesn't really need it. If you
Mm-hmm.
took it, like I'm not gonna say no to them, right? Like if you give me free CP by letting me play tactical or by making me play tactical, I'm not gonna be upset at having them. I will find a use for the CP. I can spend the resources, but I don't
Mm-hmm.
feel like I need them. Right? They're a nice to have, not a need to have.
Yeah.
This
Okay.
army can definitely like find itself just like randomly sitting on 5 CP and just be like, I don't really have anything to do with these,
Mm.
and that's fine. It's completely okay.
Okay. So moving on, Exocrine, and I imagine, yeah, probably three of them. Best shooting unit in the army.
Yeah, they're just the most consistent. It's blast. They're heavy. They can stand still. They 36 inch range, so they can come out strategic reserve. They buff your future shooting. They are toughness 10 with a 3 up save and 12 and 14 wounds, so they don't randomly die to garbage. Like a fire prism can't one shot them. Um, they're just they're just what I'm looking for. That
Mm-hmm.
damage 3 is so powerful in the current environment
Yeah.
with Chosen, Wraithguard, um, all that kind of thing, just like floating around. Damage 3 is where you want to be. And X
Mm-hmm.
Queens are cheap, cheerful, resilient enough. They are not good in combat, but like you can't just charge them with a garbage thing and not expect like if you needed to kill off a Nurgling, you could rely you might get it with an Exocrine, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm fine with that. It's where I'm comfortable with them. And then yeah, they're a big tough thing that's movement 8 that makes good use of the advance and shoot from the hive turret, makes good use of the feel no pain, is okay sitting in cover. They're very nice and long, so you can get that tail back into cover and keep yourself in, or use the massive gun to like slide behind, like slide over a line. You get a lot of like agency for like if you're coming out of strat reserve, like on an angle like that, where you can come in behind the line and poke the gun over the top because the gun is not you're not measuring from the gun, so you can poke the gun over to get like extended range into like sight lines and things like that. Very very solid unit.
So, in what circumstances or against which opponents would you consider putting them in strat reserve? Are
Any
we
opponent
talking?
where I feel like I have
Mhm.
time, right? It's basically depending on how, like, do I feel like I have time that you're not just going to jam at me, where I don't need like I don't need the threat mitigation on the board straight away, or any opponent that I think I'm going to have to go towards to deal with, or any
Mhm.
opponent that I don't want to be able to like take up safe positions in the mid board because I can threaten them with angles. So a lot of what you're trying to do with something like strategic reserve is force your opponent to screen places where you can deal with the screens to make them bleed resources for you spending nothing. So
Mhm.
you might imagine like the top left, the top of the board, there's like a place where I could threaten to come in from, but that's not really in range of any ruins. So you've got to put a unit there to stop it. I then kill that unit. You then have to put another resource there, and it costs me nothing, and it just builds me advantage. And the threat of being a strategic reserve provides me that. It also gives me ingress options. It just like gives it's
Yeah.
just a nice warm
Thing to have.
fuzzy. But if I'm
Mhm.
not getting jammed at, I don't. If I'm going to get jammed at, I'd rather have them on the board. You also, because it's strategic reserve, you do only have a 500 point limit, which you do have to be careful with this army.
Mhm. Fair enough. Okay. Next, we have a Maleceptor. Just one? No, two.
Nope.
Two Maleceptors.
Yeah,
Again, just shooting support, or is there more to it? Do you push them?
they're a little more aggressive than the X screens. Being only 18-inch range, you definitely have to play them a little more, with a little more cojones, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
But they have their toughness 11 and they have a 4 vulnerable save, so they are definitely a lot more capable of just standing on a middle objective, slam the feel no pain on them, and just be like, "I'm here, I'm holding this," and you have to commit a ton of resources, and it's still not a guarantee. They Toughness 11 is a very good threshold for just tanking through a lot of damage output. Um, they are just a good unit, and they are what they have better melee. They like with like 6 attacks at strength 7, they can actually like hurt some things. You can also take the 3 bigger attacks, which are a lot swingier. Um, Like they just do a little bit of everything. They're resilient. They shoot okay. They're hilarious into grenades from Gene Stealer cults because they have a 6 inch aura of -1 to hit.
Mm-hmm.
Which means that if the enemy unit's within, so they drop in, shoot you, hit you on sixes, and then you save on fours, and you have a feel no pain, and you just like cool man, nice effort. They're monsters, so they can stand within teleport homers range and do an action even while they're in combat. The only downside, they're a blast weapon, and they're fairly slow, moving 80 inch range. But
Mm-hmm.
again, the high turret solves a lot of that problem by providing that advanced aura, which is just another example of that synergy being really
Yeah.
powerful.
Um, is the so does the -1 to hit debuff come up a lot in your games? And then isn't it only for melee, or is it like
No,
anything?
it's within 6. You are -1 to
Okay,
hit against if the unit is within
it's an
6 of the
awkward
Maliceptor.
ability.
Yeah, if the unit is within 6 of the Maliceptor, that enemy unit is -1 to hit. I believe it doesn't affect vehicles and monsters. And
Hmm.
then if they're below half strength, they're also -1 to wound.
Right.
So it just kind of it depends how aggressively you're playing the Maliceptors. Are you charging them into things? Are you just getting them stuck in? Are they having to shoot you from short range? Something like an Inceptor squad that wants to steal an objective off you might have to come in within 6, right? That's
Hmm.
kind of the things you're looking at. It's a thing that comes up, but it's not a thing you play for, right? It's a thing,
Yeah.
or it's a thing that you want to be aware that it exists so that you can make use of it in the situations where it's correct to, but that you don't have to force. It's just a thing that it actually does, not a thing it has to make work.
Yep. But for me at least, it was easy to mistake it for what it was in the previous edition, where it was like a
With a -1
minus
strength aura, yeah, that was.
in shooting. Yeah, that was actually quite nice, and I automatically assumed it does the same
Oh, and
thing. And then
it does work on vehicles and monsters. I'm thinking of Nurglings, who
yeah,
are melee
Nurglings
only.
don't. Yeah. Hmm. Correct. All right. So yeah,
It's
cool to
also
have two
OC
of those.
4 for like no reason.
I mean, it's
And just
monsters,
like a
so
really yeah, but like the X Queen's only OC 3. It's just a nice breakpoint where most
mm,
other monsters are OC 3, and it takes objectives off of monsters pretty well. Like a Sagittarius OC 3, a Rhino's OC 2, that kind of thing.
hmm.
So it does its job okay there.
Yep. Uh, and then maybe a question also about uh, WTC tables, especially, and the heavy WTC tables. Would you see difficulties with what we see in this list already so far? So
I mean,
the Hive
it's an
Tyrant.
incentive to play a little bit more out of strategic reserve. That's all it really
Mm,
does. But the WC boards are usually like not too bad because the terrain is big enough to hide them, and you have the big base plates that they can pretty easily get onto with advanced moves and things like that. And they're tall enough that they can see over the top of like the small ruins, so you can definitely like get a little bit out of them. It's not perfect. They definitely have like a level of a degree of awkwardness in there, but nothing that I'm like upset about.
hmm. Okay. All right. Moving on. The newer elixir, and just not just one, but two. Again, those things are new. So to anyone who has not gotten acquainted with them yet, what do they do? Why do you have
Yeah.
two?
So the
Why not three?
Neurolictor is a 4 up invulnerable save lone operative, which enough already there is 65 points value. Slam it on my list. It's toughness 5 with 7 wounds. Value, value, value. Takes 4 damage, 2 hits, and 3 damage, 3 hits to kill it. Perfect. Like seven's such an awkward number to deal with. On
Hmm.
top of that, it's not terrible in combat with 6 attacks. It's strength 6 to hit on twos. It'll fight other skirmisher units. It's only OC1, not perfect. It itself is stealth and lone operative, and infiltrator, so we can get onto an objective pretty quickly, be annoying. And then if it kills a character, it gets a CP, and it'll never happen. But if it does, you'll feel great. Um, in your command phase, you pick a unit within 12. Doesn't have to be in line of sight. It takes a battle shock. So if your opponent's flipped an objective off you, you can flip it back in the command phase on decent odds. You can use it to force units that are behind walls to take a battle shock test and just be awkward to them. And then it also has a 12-inch aura of if an enemy unit within 12 of it is battle shocked, it's -1 to hit. And if that unit is battle shocked and I attack it, I get +1 to wound. Just a very, very nice flatline buff, flatline debuff that just it smooths the edges of the turn of damage output being terrible and just
Hmm.
gives you a couple of little loan up units that can be awkward and annoying and on objectives. And, even if your opponent flips an objective, they haven't necessarily flipped an objective. And they give you just that little damage up buff. You pop your shadow in the warp and you go to Tyron shooting and you get +1 to wound that your opponent suddenly wasn't expecting. And suddenly they take a bunch of extra damage or anything like that. And it's just fine. They're not anything special. They're 65 points of just raw. They do a little bit of everything enough that they're worth it, and everything they do is something you're looking for. Except that plus that one CP, you're never getting that CP.
Yeah,
Don't even pretend.
and they kind of invalidated the normal leaper, I guess. because
The generic lictor lost its invulnerable save
sorry, Lictor.
in order to
Mhm.
have fight first and +1 damage. And for me, with the job that I'm looking for out of the Neurolictor, the Lictor is just not as
But
good
the
at that.
Lictors in general.
Yeah,
Hmm.
it's also 5 points more expensive. Losing the invulnerable save, the Lictor used to have a 5 invulnerable save and it lost it in the Codex. That was the kicker for me. It was the loss of invulnerable save.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. Then we have Pyrovores, and then are those just objective holders, or do you have a specific mission
Yeah,
for them as
I'll
well?
say a lot less words on Pyrovores and Ripper Swarms. They're cheap scoring units that are. It's 100 points of cheap scoring garbage. It's 4 models that can come in off a board edge and be awkward and score points. And teleport homers, Rippers can deep strike. Pyrovores do have the additional synergy of they are a decently resilient model. They're toughness 6 with 5 wounds and a 3 up save. Very capable of just standing a place and not really dying. Something that isn't a concerted effort. They have a good twin linked flamer and they remove cover when they shoot something. Just they
Hmm.
do a little bit of everything. I would run 9 if it wasn't like insane because they stopped being good at their first job, which is score points.
Hmm.
But like I would not complain to see like 5 in the list or something like that. It's just opportunity cost, right? And then Rippers, yeah, the same thing. They're just scoring garbage. They're just going to drop in. They're a 40 millimeter base. It's hard to screen. They can drop into your backfield and score whatever, right? They don't have to be any good at it. They're just 20 points, right? Again, it's hard to be upset at a 20 point model, whatever it does, or 20 point
And then they
unit,
can be
whatever it does.
really annoying to your opponent as well by pushing away deep strikes and so on, which
Yep,
is also
exactly.
of value.
They
Yeah.
just do a little bit of everything you're looking for 20 points. It's impossible to be upset at them. That's
Hmm.
my general perception on Rippers and Pyrovores. And Pyrovores also happen to be just one of the best 30 points you can spend in the game.
Yeah. Agreed. All right. One of my favorite units is next. So the Trygon.
The Trygon is my just straight favorite unit in this army.
Mm,
The Trygon is, I was speaking about it earlier, it has the ability that the Inceptors have in Space Marines. When it deep strikes, it can come in 3 away, but it can't charge this turn. And the this turn criteria means that works really well with rapid ingress. So all this guy does, 90% of your games, is you go to your opponent's home objective and you say, hey, I could rapid ingress a Trygon here this turn. And then your opponent mad scrambles to deal with that. And then you don't bother doing anything. And then
yep.
you do it again the next turn, and it just applies and exerts pressure without committing a resource in a way that your opponent has to play around. And all you get to do is you get to look at every single thing that your opponent stopped you doing with the Trygon, and then pick the best thing that they didn't stop. And then you get to do that if that's right for you. Or if they made a mistake, you get to punish that. And the Trygon, for 180 points, punishes mistakes very well. It doesn't mind, like, if it gets stuck onto your opponent's home objective, it just sits there and deploys teleport homers, and that's fine. It can do that while it's in combat. It's got a gun that can theoretically hurt things. A lot of armies, you can deep strike it 3 inches away in their face and say, you can't kill this now because you have nothing here to deal with this. And
Hmm.
suddenly your opponent's target priority gets rapidly shifted because suddenly they're about to lose a flank they didn't expect to because the Trygon single handedly collapsed it. I adore the Trygon. It's the reason I would play Tyranids. If I was going to play
Yeah.
Tyranids tournament, it would be because the Trygon exists. The data
Yeah.
sheet is
Absolutely.
so much fun.
Hmm. I agree wholeheartedly with this. It's just, and I played. I think last week I played one of those. Is it Englesios archetypes? I don't know how to
Oh,
pronounce that
The
name.
Alex Engels list with the
Yeah.
triple Moloch, double Trigon. Yeah.
Exactly, snaky list, and it was just so fun to play against it. Also, that I mean, yeah, I would put three in every list just because they are so much fun.
There is a hard limit for me at 2 because you can only rapid ingress 2. And they are really bad when they don't
Correct.
rapid ingress.
Yeah,
You are not just rawing that 9 inch shard. That is not what you want to be in your life.
and you don't want to run them on the table either because they
No,
are
they don't have a
fairly
way to go back
squishy.
in reserve. So
Yeah, exactly. All right, let me go back to the word file. Zoanthropes.
yep,
So yeah, how much trust do you put in them because they can
absolutely
get
none. That's why there's one
yeah.
squad. And the list ends after that squad is on ropes. So there's
Mm,
definitely not more. I personally would not run more than 6. One squad is nice because it's nice to have a thing that can be like it's 3d3 shots with blast. I kind of try to think of them as like they're a bad Forge Fiend, right? They come in, it's
yeah.
3d3 shots plus blast at 7 2d3. And do you know what? A bad Forge Fiend is still pretty good. And sometimes they can be 3 last cannon shots, and they are enough that your opponent has to kind of respect their shooting, but
Hmm.
also not enough that your opponent will respect their shooting. So sometimes they get an opportunity they shouldn't. Sometimes they clip a thing. They also give you a 6 vulnerable save with an aura. So like occasionally that can keep like a gargoyle or a monster alive that maybe shouldn't be. And it's just enough that I want one squad and not enough that I want any more than that. If I was playing something like Synaptic Nexus, where they have the fallback and shoot stratagem, I would consider six. If I was playing something like Vanguard, where they have the go back into reserve stratagem, again, I would consider six. But Invasion Fleet just only does a little bit for them, so
Hmm.
I'm only running a little bit of them.
All right. Would you rather food slug them or put them in strategic reserve and do like
They're
a blow from the side?
almost always going into strategic reserve.
Hmm.
They are movement five. I
Yeah.
just simply, unless again, if I play against Orchard World Eaters, I'm starting every unit of my army on the board that isn't exactly called Rippers. But in general, like my default state is going to be that these guys go in reserve.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Then we have.
That's it. That's the
That's
list.
it. That's the list. Okay. That's
Yeah, it's in
that's that's where it ends.
all the units are in alphabetical order. Zone troops is going to be the last.
Good. Okay. So how does this list fare into the top dogs of the meta? Like,
Not great, my man.
yeah, yeah, I imagine. So yeah, you did mention the Eldar in part one that there is no game into Eldar
There
unless.
isn't no game into Eldar, but like you're relying on them making a mistake.
Hmm.
CSM feels the same. You can't kill a transport behind a wall, right? There is nothing in Tyranids that kills a transport behind a wall. You just have to deal with it. So you have to move block it or stop it scoring. And they just do too much damage. Votan and Tau again similarly awkward. Tau is like unique. Tau and Votan are like a little bit okay because you get the armor wide lethal hits, and like it's fine, but it's just every single thing that feels like it feels like every army in the top six, you have to work so hard
Yeah.
for it to be okay. And every army outside that, it's like, yeah, I feel like I've got a reasonable game here, which is why I'm not playing Tyranids for tournaments right now. Is that just
Hmm.
I think if you were committed, if you were John Lennon and you were like, yeah, man, all I want to do right now is play Tyranids, like you could win a GT or a major with this list, right? It's not, it's very possible. You know, you get the right matchups, you dodge the other player, and you get lucky in the right match. You get lucky in the other matchup. You know, the guy makes a mistake. The guy's not playing the Incarn for some reason. You know, there's lots of fail cases. I just don't want to be the one that's working that hard for it right now. So this
Hmm.
is relegated to a practice and RTT's army for me. Like it's a fun army. It's incredibly rewarding to play. I love the Trygon. The advantage shoot on all the big monsters is great fun, but it's like it's a 7 or 8 out of 10, and I don't want to be a 7 or 8 out of 10 player. Even if I could make it a 9, I don't want to have to put that much effort into it. I want an army that I can play for 10 rounds of a tournament and be fresh as a daisy at the end of it, not an army where I'm sobbing into my cups at the end of game 2 because I'm just so sick of moving gargoyles.
So I also wanted to ask about the the things that are missing in this list. So the choices that haven't been made, essentially, and one of those is the one that immediately comes to mind because those are new models, beautiful models, huge models, centerpieces that you would like to see on the table. So the Norns, either the emissary or the assimilator. Don't you see a place for them? And is
So
it because of the price or
just
the,
apply the Norn to your forehead. It's
as
just so
as it
sad.
says on the screen?
It's so hard to use. It If it was actually tanky when it got to its objective, it would be close to playable, but
Hmm.
it just isn't. You get onto your objective and then you die. And it's like, well, why did I put all that effort into getting onto my objective that I picked if I was just gonna die to the Wraith Guard or Coran or Fuegan or broadsides or blah 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 blah
The
units, right?
list gets
Like
very long. Yeah.
everything people are planning to kill things that are so much tougher than the Norn, which means that the Norn just isn't functional in the way that it
Hmm.
wants to be. In 6 months' time, if the meta is a little bit more chill, like Ultha Moment's already taken a dive, that's definitely one thing that was really hurting the Norn gone away. Like I could see it, but right for this environment right now, I think the Norn puts a very real ceiling on how well you can do. It is it makes the list feel more like Knights, right? Where it's a bit of a gatekeeper. There will be armies that can't deal with it, but any army that can, it doesn't matter that you have a Norn because the Norn is just going to die, and you're going to wish you had a different unit.
Mm. All
And
right.
I just don't want to be the person playing that game.
Hmm. So again, I don't know how much this holds to this day, but I remember listening to the review of the Index done by David Gaylord and Yoko. And I remember that when they were doing the Index, they haven't had many games played with the Index, but they were considering What is better, a hive, a walk rent, a hive tyrant without wings, or a swarm lord? And
It's the
again,
walk run every day of the week.
because of the price, or just
Because of the free battle
the
tactic, the
hmm
one CP and one free battle tactic are not the same value because the free battle tactic allows you to repeat a stratagem, and the repeat stratagem on the feel no pain means you can have two tanky units a turn. The swarm lord means you can spend that CP twice, but you can't use
hmm
it on the feel no pain again, and that's the one that's valuable. The swarm lord also doesn't convert the advanced charge. He has the vect ability, and the vect ability took a nosedive in viability after the changes anyway. He's also more expensive and doesn't have a gun, and just like no, thank you. I'm good. I would the free battle tactic repetition on the Feel No Pain is by far the thing that I'm the most invested in from the Tyrant and the advanced charge aura and or advanced shoot aura, and both of those things you get nothing even remotely close to on the Swarmlord. Therefore, and those are the only two reasons in the list. Everything else after that is icing on the cake that happens to be there and happens to be valuable in certain ways, but it is
hmm
only for those two abilities that he is in the list. And then everything else is just a nice to have. Swarmlord only brings the nice to haves, does not bring the reason the Tyrant's in the list. Therefore, Swarmlord has no reason to be in this list. The Swarmlord, I think, is okay in the Swarming Masses one, the Unending Swarm, because he gives
hmm
you the +1 CP for the regeneration stratagem, which can be okay, but also he's 270 points. Just don't bother. You can do better.
All
If
right.
he had like dev wounds on his sword or something that like made him at least feel okay, or was like
Yeah.
higher than strength 9, then we would maybe be having a conversation. But for the time being, sadly not. I don't
Mm.
think.
Okay. Then again, veering away from your list for a moment. I need to ask because that used to be one of my favorite units in like
If
eighth
you ask me about
edition and stuff.
Hiveguard, I'm dropping the call.
No, no, not Hiveguard. Gene Stealers. You've mentioned I think in part one, you've mentioned that in the Vanguard Onslaught detachment, they actually do have a place.
They are
So,
completely
uh-huh,
okay in that detachment. Yep. They are 2-win models with an invulnerable save that can cause some problems when they redeploy and are on top of your opponent and advance and charge and go deep and like pick up some random scoring garbage. You can like multi-charge like a bunch of little things, tag a bunch of stuff, and just be like, hey, you've got to kill 20 wounds plus a character, maybe with plus or minus a character with an invulnerable save and 2 wounds each. And there is a chance that you don't get it right, that you misallocate damage, or that you stay too far back as a result of it. And I keep like 3 or 4 dudes, and then they fall back and they charge something else and they cause problems again, and the cycle repeats. And that is fine. It is completely a reasonable thing that you can do. It is not going to be like it's not the best unit in the army. It's not the worst unit in the army. You will not be upset to have them. You are also not going to win a lot of games purely because of them, but they will give you the right kind of space. I don't
hmm
hate 5 mans in general in other detachments, but I think they're a little bit like there's like 14 things that can do that job, and Gene Stealers are
yeah,
just one of them. And I would rather play something like Raveners in that slot, but you can
hmm
definitely like you could do it and nobody would be upset with you. Um, but in general, like I think in that detachment, they're fine. Outside that, you can probably do something better. But again, if you were going to put like 5 Gene Stealers in a list, you would like fine, whatever.
hmm
Like they're just a data sheet that's okay. They're nothing special. One detachment buffs them up a little bit to the point where they're probably worth considering. And then the rest of them are just like if you really wanted to run Gene Stealers, you could put them in, and they would be okay. They are scout rather than infiltrate, which does have like
its downsides.
a modicum of downside and also some upside.
hmm
They're good with the redeploy from Neuronode and Vanguard Invasion more than anything else because you can respond to where your opponent has put their forward pressure, and then scout, move, advance, charge, and then from there, like there's a lot more like off to the races with them versus the like in another detachment where they're just scouting. If they infiltrated, there would be probably more of a conversation.
Yeah. Is a Broodlord a must with them, or
He's not a must, but I think if you were going to play Vanguard Invasion, you probably should just bring him
mhm,
because if you're going to try and go for that kind of alpha strike, you might as well make it an alpha strike.
the proper one? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Then I need to ask, because again, another thing that is missing in your list and missing in many lists that I see online are
It's
the
a cute
Venom.
hint then that it's not missing, it's just not good.
It's just not good. No, but the Venom throats and the Psychophage. You mentioned the Psychophage when we were discussing the part one, and you've mentioned that it's a big centerpiece monster that probably should be doing more. So it gives out this accept feel no pain, and then the Venom throats also debuff the opponents. Uh, Essentially, people don't take them because it doesn't make sense to to try and increase the survivability of units that die so easily anyway, or is it
So
something else? Am I
the
missing something?
Venomthropes are good in specifically the swarm detachment because you have so many bodies that are worth getting -1 to hit on,
hmm
and it drastically improves the survivability because they're not going to be tanky any other way, so they might as well have that. Outside that, it's a little bit. They're not the fastest. They're not very resilient, so they become very vulnerable. And then it's only -1 to hit. There's a lot of ways to get -1 to hit in the game right now, and it doesn't stack. So degraded vehicles don't care.
And it
Um,
doesn't even apply to all the units, I think. It doesn't
yeah,
apply to
exactly. The
monsters and
stealth
so on.
only applies to infantry. The
Yeah.
cover applies to everything, and cover's so easy to get that it's just hard to justify. You just don't play that much infantry in a Tyranid list these days. I don't know if you ran through that, but like there's infantry in there, but none of it's infantry that needs to be survivable. And then the
Yeah.
Psychophage is a 6-inch Film of Pain aura, and it itself has a 5-up Film of Pain, but it's fairly ignorable, and there's already a film of pain stratagem, and it's not really worth spending 125 points on. It just kind of doesn't get there on any avenue. It doesn't do enough to justify its points cost on the film of pain. It doesn't really do any damage. It's not that survivable itself, and even if it was survivable, like it's not doing anything while being survivable. So for 10 more points you want an exocrine instead of having 20% more exocrine on the first one that you ran. And yeah,
Hmm.
sure, you can't run a third X screen, but I would rather have a third Maliceptor over it, and I already don't have a third Maliceptor.
Okay. I had something else in the. Yeah, you never mentioned Carnifexes in the old One Eye. So, is that viable? I see a
Yeah,
lot of
Carnifex
people
World One
actually
Eye
bringing
is
it.
super solid. Yeah, I think it's a very reasonable inclusion for just shy of 400 points. It's completely fine. It's not my personal preference. I find it, um, it's a lot of volume shooting basically, and
Hmm.
I'm with Gene Cults broadly being on the way out of the meta. I'm not that worried about needing that kind of volume shooting. Old One Eye himself is like pretty hitting in combat and has his full rerolls, and his squad like shoots pretty hard. Has a bunch of blast weapons with like invasion fleet giving you sustained or lethal on the right target. It's good. It's just it's a very it centralizes your list around itself a lot and makes the game very much about it in a way that I would rather run more small things to like abuse
Hmm.
because you're probably talking like an Exocrine, a Maliceptor coming out, and then like also a squad of gargoyles and a Ripper, and like I would rather have the four things than the one thing,
Yeah.
but just because I'm always worried that just having one big centralized source of thing for my opponent to put damage on is a little sketchy, and I would
Hmm.
rather not be in that kind of situation.
Yeah. I completely get that.
But they're good. They're 100% a good unit.
Hmm. How about? And again, this is something that I've heard about Tyranids, and I haven't heard about any other army that potentially their flyers could see use, like the Harpy, for example, with what it does.
Probably not. It doesn't really shoot very hard. The making a spore mine is okay, but the points cost on it is like not cheap enough.
Hmm.
And the hover rules aren't very good. Neither are the fire rules. I'm not a fan.
Okay.
It doesn't really do enough of anything. For context, for anybody who remembers a Harper from last edition, instead of 6 shots, it now has D3 shots with twin linked.
Yeah.
Um, it's not very good. I don't really rate it.
Okay.
I think there was a bit
Uh,
of hype when like the initial like, oh, we can only run one Biovore now. Do we still need that? And the answer was just no. Just learn to play with one Biovore.
so, by the way, with the one Biovore, does it have a rule somewhere that it's only one, or it only makes sense to bring one?
Only one Biovore can make spores per turn, so
Okay. All right.
so
So
you
it's
only
not even
really
that
need one.
because I thought that you could. I haven't read into that yet, but I
So
thought
the,
that
the
you could
wording
bring
on it
two.
is each of Sporocyst, Harpy, and Biovore have the rule to make spore mines, and one of each data sheet per turn can use that ability. The other ones would
Oh,
be
okay.
shooting or
All
bombing or
right.
whatever. So there's no real point bringing a second Biovore
Yeah.
because well, the second one is just shooting a bad gun. So you just run one Biovore.
Unless you want resiliency, but then again, yeah,
They're
oh, they don't die that
it's
much.
completely fine to put the feel no pain on that thing if it start getting shot by random
Hmm.
incidentals. It's toughness 6 with 3-up save and 5 wounds and probably cover. Like if you can't keep it alive under like the at least okay circumstances, it should be fine.
Yeah, I was playing against Tim from Team Netherlands, I think, a week ago, and I put three Plague Scrollers with the buffs into Biovore. Didn't kill it, so it's it can be resilient. Um, one more thing, one last thing that I wanted to ask about in terms of units that potentially could be brought, and I think Sam Lemon was running a list with those warriors. Again, is there any viability in them? What's the point of having two different units with ranged weapons and melee weapons? What happened to one unit with a mixture of both? And
Yeah, I
does
mean, technically
any of those work?
the melee warrior, the range warriors do have both, right? Because they have a gun and a melee. They're just they're an okay unit that holds the buff from the Winged Hive Tyrant pretty well in Vanguard Invasion, which makes them have the keyword for advance and charge and fall back in charge and like load up stratagem and things like that. And the melee warriors are like AP2 twin linked with 6 attacks each. They hit reasonably hard for not a lot of points. and they're just a nice thing to have, like be another anchor unit. The ranged warriors shoot okay with a bunch of blast weapons. They're just fine. I don't think they're very exciting outside of Vanguard with winged hive turns, but in Vanguard with winged hive turns, they're completely reasonable. And I would like two squads of them is a completely reasonable thing to run. So is one, so is none, right?
Hmm.
They're an okay data sheet in that situation. I also don't generally like for 70 points, the ranged warriors are just okay. They fall back, shoot, and charge, and they have like two blast weapons plus a regular gun, and then they're like okay in combat. They're just like Tyranids have an absolute glut of strength 5 AP 1 damage 1, and it's kind of up to you to figure out where you want that from or if you even want it. And I kind of default to I don't really want that, but if I did want it, Warriors, Raveners, and Von Ryans all kind of sit in that slot of a thing with that kind of profile that is okay if you want it, but if you don't want it, don't worry about it.
Hmm. All right. Okay. So that's the units. I mean, we touched on the missions, but again, which secondaries would you most comfortably go with? Just behind enemy lines and
My,
homers,
my
or?
default is behind enemy lines and homers, and then if behind enemy lines is going to be awkward, that then starts looking at other options, whether that's a kill
Hmm.
secondary, whether that's engaging all fronts, or whether that's cleanse, depends on the situation. And then if it's going to be really tough, then yeah, tactical is always there for you.
Hmm. All right.
But I would default to behind enemy lines and homers because it's just so consistently easy to do with Tyranids. So
Yeah, unless you're
you can
playing
get
on search and destroy, to be
7 points a turn off a Biovore. Why would you say no?
yeah, as I said, unless you play on search and destroy, and your enemy is like really like his
Yeah,
deployment
for
is
sure.
full of stuff.
And
Yeah.
even then, it kind of depends on what the deployment zone layout looks like. If there's a very empty space that your opponent's going to struggle to screen without dying for standing there, it could be worth taking it to just, and then you just take the middle and like you try to push into it, and you get like 12 on behind enemy lines, but you killed a bunch of stuff for free. That's fine too, right? You can use your secondaries to exert pressure on your opponent. You don't just have to use them to score points.
Hmm. Okay. I never asked about and you don't really hear about that anymore. The Tyrannocyte.
No,
Tyrannocyte.
don't
Yeah,
ask
that
about it. It's bad. It's fine. We can move on. Nobody has to think about the Tyrannosaurus ever again.
completely no application.
It's too expensive and strategic reserve exists.
Okay. All right.
It's like a
Uh,
hundred and something points, and it's not good at shooting, and it doesn't hold big stuff. And don't worry about it.
mm-hmm. All right. Okay. Uh, at this point, I think I'm left with one last question. Unless there will be something more that you want to mention about the Tyranids, but the use of Shadow in the War. Like, is there any specific best moment to use this?
So there's kind of I say two general schools of thought and like one exception to that.
Hmm.
So you can kind of go for your opponent's turn two scoring turn when they're about to score, start of their command phase. You just every game slam the shadow in the war button, make them lose a bunch of primary, give them a bunch of like fail states to recover from, and stop them using some strategy on the turn. That's usually the turn that like is a very pivotal for the game state. Maybe turn three if like the turn two isn't super like extended, and your opponent's got a lot of units and objectives, and you're not pressuring them that hard. But usually like the turn two drop shadow on the war on them, make them take a bunch, and then rolls into your turn. They're still battle shocked. You get to do a bunch of your damage. You've got your neurolictors and your shooting and all that kind of thing, and they can't use defensive strategy, and that's fine. And then like you can also do like the turn five end of game scoring. So you do it in there. So say you're playing something like priority targets or take it hold, where you do it in their turn five command phase to try and deny them like the end game scoring or two chances to do it with priority targets. And that's kind of like the other general one. And then the last one is if you're just about to go for a damage turn and you need your opponent to like just lose some damage, some defensive strats, you can just you're about to just like full send into an army that's got a bunch of -1 damages and things like that. And you're just like, I want some of this to be less resilient. You can just press the button there and just try to go for it and get a bunch of neurolictor bonus damage. And that's kind of like maybe you've gone first and you're just going to use it in your turn two command phase for damage output, and that's fine too. That's kind of like the
Hmm.
general use cases of it. I generally prefer the turn two, just like deny them a bunch of primary, put them in recovery mode, and make it scramble, and then try to get a bunch of extra out of it. But the other situations are definitely ones that have come up, and like the turn four or five, and then there's kind of like there's always the I have a specific scenario where I want to make this really awkward for you, and if I can make you fail a battle shock in this situation, it wins the game. So an example might be if you've got a squad of Wraith Guard that are in combat and they're going to fall back and shoot this turn, and if you can battle shock them and they can't fall back and shoot, you might win the game off of that. So you might conserve it for that kind of thing against certain matchups like Wraith Guard.
Hmm. Okay.
Because if you can
All
kill
right.
a third of them to battle shock, and then also they can't fall back and shoot, suddenly maybe that player's having a bad situation. And then you have like the ability to stack debuffs. Maybe you can have them be next to Death Leaper for -1 leadership. Maybe you can have them be next to you've got the nerd turn on the board. Suddenly they're leadership 8 and they're needing to roll a 7 or less again, even on leadership 6, which is 56% chance. Very likely to fail. So that's kind of like the general use cases for Shadow. It's not a massively you don't have to be super precious with it. You can just kind of use it for whatever, and then as long as you have a plan for why you're using it, it's pretty easy to justify retroactively. But like, yeah, I thought I would try to do this, and then there's always just the like sometimes your opponent just passes all their battle shocks, or sometimes they just fail all the battle shocks, and the game just starts going really easy because of it, or goes really hard because of it.
Mm-hmm. All right. I also forgot to ask about the parasite of Mortex. Like, is this?
He's not synapse. You can't take any of the cool enhancements.
Yeah.
Just don't bother. It's a little awkward.
Mm-hmm. It's a
I
shame.
it's with the Neurolictor existing, it's hard to justify it. Before it was like the next best loan up after like the second Lictor, and you
Mm-hmm.
maybe wanted it, but broadly not a fan.
Mm. All right. All right. I'm just looking at my shelf with the units standing there. Is there
Stop
anything
looking.
else
We've
that
run
I
out.
have
We've
missed?
genuinely. You're just
I
gonna make
think we.
yourself sad. Just close us out.
Yeah. 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 Probably we have to. So yeah. Any final words or comments about the Tyranids and the book itself? Because
Turn is
we've
going to be a
analyzed the
great
book.
book in 6 months, and I've been saying that for 3 months. So maybe I'll be right this time.
So
No, Tyranids are
we.
super fun. There's a lot of really engaging things in there. There's a lot of problems to ask for the right army, but also everything feels very fair when they're doing it. Except maybe the Shadow and the Orc when you fail a bunch of them, like that feels really depressing. But generally, everything Tyranids does is doing at you pretty honestly. Like with now that you can't run like 3 Biovores and just perpetually make Spore Mines, like the one Biovore feels like a concession to the army's playstyle. Gargoyles can be obnoxious, but they're definitely like the army is pretty honest in what it's doing to you, and you will like I don't really see anybody complaining about playing games into Tyranids now, unless they're just like relentlessly getting choked out by 200 gaunts. In which case, yeah, man, I'm sorry that happens.
Mm,
But in general, I think the army's super fun. The army's super rewarding to play with and against, and it's hard to be upset by like any way that it approaches the game.
mm-hmm. All right. Okay. Ines, I think I forgot to ask you to do that in part one. So, would you like to plug anything for our listeners?
Yeah, I'll chat out StatCheck. So I'm Innes. I'm part of StatCheck. StatCheck is our media conglomerate, I suppose. We run a bunch of
Mm-hmm.
stuff from podcasts to coaching to ELO and CRS, and we do like the national rankings for America and Canada. There's 3 shows on the network with StatCheck and the Matrix and Exxon one, which cover general 40k news, um, getting better at 40k while doing like the life on top of that, and then very specifically team stuff around the Matrix. And those are every Tuesday, every other Wednesday for X1 for End of the Matrix, and every other Thursday for X1 at various times across the UK. It's best to check the website because, frankly, the time zone conversions are nightmares. Um, we have an awesome group of people. We have Anthony from Team USA, Typhus and Puma from Team Poland, Nathan from Team England, myself from Team Scotland, Jeremy from Team Canada, and also Nathan and Cliff, who do our stats and coverage side of things. We're going to be covering events like the Cali Cup. We're going to be having like we're going to be contributing to the stream there. We worked with WTC and War Games Live, WTC. So yeah, check us out if anything in there sounds interesting to you. There's almost always something to play with, even if it's just the metadata dashboard, seeing how your army stacks up or how your favorite detachment's doing into something else. There's always something to play about on that website. We've also got stuff like articles up there if that's something that interests you as well.
Very well put. I probably wouldn't have done you justice like you did. So,
Frankly,
yeah.
I'm better at doing it on other shows than my own show, and I don't understand it. But one day I will. Um,
But I think you came to the point where you actually memorized it, and you don't have to read from a piece of paper anymore, which is great.
yeah, I'm just
but
making it up on the show as I go along now to look like a simpering buffoon, maybe.
but
Um,
sounds very professional. All right. So listen, everyone. Make sure that you go to StatCheck, check them out if you haven't already. Although I think our viewership overlaps
Cross
to a certain
dimensional,
degree.
yeah. And
Yeah.
also,
So
if you're listening to this and it's not like the 20th of October, that you listen to this, this was Patreon bonus content for Contact Lost. So you should check out Contact Lost on Patreon if you want to see this a couple of weeks earlier. So do that because you can see awesome stuff like the Space Marine Masterclass with Lester from Team Poland. Contact Lost do an awesome job with all this stuff. They do coverage for a bunch of events like LGT and WTC. And if you want to see that continue, give them a check out on Patreon. They serve your support and they have cool merch and dice that roll sixes.
you're too sweet. Thank you. Um, Yeah, there's nothing left for me to say. So, like, subscribe, and so on, and follow us for more amazing content. Yeah, we're going to have more master classes. We're going to have we started the series of articles on our Facebook with different hashtag for different days. So there are some posts by Myson when it comes to like competitive play. There are tournament recaps on Tuesdays, I think, that Joker does with our guests, and then there's my thoughtful Thursday, which is about mental health and neurodiversity and so on in our hobby, which is again something niche that you don't really hear about a lot. So do give that a read as well, because we're doing that for you. With that, thank you everyone. Thank you, Ines. You've been an absolute pleasure as always, and a fountain of knowledge. And until next time, bye everyone.